Sunday, March 8th? When you almost die. Did you see that sunset? So brief. Today we're going to talk about Zizek, and I'm going to be on a bike, biking through New York. Ideology is Zizek's thing I want to talk about. Desire and ideology. So lacan psychology, as the wind blows in my face, is about the symbolic other. Kind of like Big Brother, you know. Except we don't live in a society of Big Brother anymore. We live in a surveillance symbolic other. Boop. I just biked on a bridge. And now I am thinking about I'm loving it. Slavic Zizek. Continuation of Hegel's thinkings. Zizek and media studies. I've been reading. And I wrote this on a piece of paper for what I want to talk about today. The inspiration for today's talk is I was at Apollo Bagels. Everybody knows Apollo Bagels. I got the white fish salad on a sesame bagel. So, I'm online. As a sociologist, I'm studying. Honestly, it's more anthropological work. But, right, you pull up, get your order, there's 4 people at the register. All your, young, I don't think they're teenagers, but, teens to mid-20s maybe. But, the typical sorority, fraternity type people at the front register. And then in the back, the cooks are middle-aged, most likely Hispanic. They all kind of look, Hispanic or black, immigrants. And it's just such a fascinating, difference in what we consider service work. You kind of get it, but it's also kind of it's eerily strange. And basically what I was thinking for today, instead of reading all passages, I just want to read specific quotes that I find super relevant to both that story and more so this time the performance of authenticity. And this was all inspired because I really did not like the way that white girl was trying to speak Spanish to the worker. I shouldn't hate. I'm not a hater, but it was just gracias. I understand why they hate Americans. As an American, love America. Anyways, okay. So, I highlighted specific parts. This is Jody Dean on the Real Internet. Zizek considers several ways computer-mediated interaction threatens virtuality. One is the loss of the binding power or performative efficacy of words. Words are no longer subjectivized. Bro, what the fuck? The New York concrete jungle, a dream tomato. Okay. Excerpt. Jody Dean, The Real Internet. Zizek considers several ways computer-mediated interaction threatens virtuality. One is the loss of the binding power or performative efficacy of words. Words are no longer subjectivized insofar as they fail to induce the subject to stand by them. It's giving very much Jacques Derrida's rhetoric. Words are just words. The performance of authenticity, where people are trying to be real by speaking real shit, but all the real shit is just a performance of real. I don't know, it's people put on a persona of real when their actual personalities sometimes are more interesting. Sorry, the background noise of New York is crazy. Like, why was there a sailor anchor honk in the middle of, like, who's dying? Anyways. So, I mean, already, let me continue. Zizek asks, is not one of the possible reactions to the excessive filling in of the voids in cyberspace, therefore informational anorexia. The desperate refusal to accept information insofar as it occludes the presence of the real. And I'm thinking about this because right now, when you try to start a brand in today's age, you're showing everything, the mistakes, the growth, all this social media strategy is about how do you build a brand from scratch. Back when YouTube DIYs is how to bake bread, now it's how to make a business, make a business. Which is true, you have, it's great information out there. Knowledge is so universal these days, but, there is knowledge, but there's also the search for understanding this knowledge. So, in some ways, this search for knowledge is just as important. I am forgetting his name, but he's an Israeli economist. Economist. He recently won the Nobel Prize in cultural work. Basically, I'm gonna reference his name in the captions, but he was saying innovation right now is lacking culture. A lot of the great.
Going to 33rd.
He basically talks about this, like back in the Renaissance or the Industrial Revolution. There was both a technological innovation as well as a cultural revolution happening simultaneously. And so, historically, cultural and maybe I want to say materialistic innovation, because it's not just technology, but you can always say like everything is a technology. The wheel was a technology. Sort of happened hand in hand, right? Now we're at a stage where there's such a big cultural lag, because culture has no longer become like a glue, a social glue that used to, combine societies. Now culture is capital. Pierre Bourdieu writes about this a lot in Distinction. You have your social capital, cultural capital, alongside your economic capital to determine class, upper, middle, lower class. But I want to dig deeper on this cultural capital. It's not just like your behavior, your etiquette that determines culture as capital. Culture itself is being formed in the same way money is being formed or being made, like capital is being built. What I mean is now our cultural capital is just economic capital at the same time. Example of what I mean by this. I'm in a very Chinese time of my life, this cultural phenomenon that is happening. And suddenly you're seeing all these not mainstream, but just Chinese conglomerates, international boba shops, the bobafication of, all these shops coming in. And it's a huge cultural soft power, stance that China is making. But at the same time, this cultural, boom, bada bing, bada boom, doesn't feel cultural. It doesn't feel Chinese, you know what I mean? Or maybe this is just how I feel. Like, it just feels like another capital on capital fight, like Chinese capital fighting American capital. It's not East versus West culture. It's literally, I got a lot of money, I got a lot of Chinese money, and I'm gonna show you, the West, how much money I got. So, long story short, I just think going back to Zizek, like informational anorexia, I think that's so interesting. Like, big data, too much information has made us forget what it means to see in the negatives, to see what happens when there is a lack of information, because that's just as wise, I believe. Like in art, you have negative space, architecture and design, Bauhaus, and obviously, art history, you have periods where you go side to side, or you go on either extreme. Sometimes it's too decorative, like the Baroque, and then you kind of have like the opposite effect, and everything is like abstract modern. You strip everything. But at its core, there's like three things, right? Utility, beauty, and function. It's like the Holy Trinity. And right now we're in a space where everything is exploding. There's too much, you gotta have too much beauty, too much utility, too much function. And then it's like, I don't know, what is this, But yeah. Anyways, okay. So that's part one of, I loved that quote. The second part is Zizek's ideology. Like, this is where I think most people who read Zizek fall into. And for those who don't, ideology is like a very lacan psychology concept. In layman terms, it's psychoanalysis, but with the profound theme of desire. Freudian psychology was all about like sexual repression, and then like somehow everything goes back to mother trauma, or repressed sexual tension or something. And then you have Jungian psychology, which I see it as like Freud, Jung, Lacan, and then modern CBT, cognitive behavioral stuff. But Jungian psychology kind of deviated from this sexual desire, but instead of seeing the shadow. Carl Jung's famous, collective unconscious is about looking at your shadow, looking at the dark parts, looking at your negatives, and seeing what that actually reveals about you instead. And it's not repressed, it's not that your shadow is a repressed version of yourself. It's just, and I don't even want to say it's the ugly parts of yourself. It's just human nature. It's the part of human nature that didn't follow the social order, the order. And according to the second law of thermodynamics, entropy is natural. Disorder is what's natural to this material world. So why not in the spiritual world? But that's Jung. And then Lacan psychology, from my understanding, I didn't read too much on it, but it's on desire and ideology. It focuses on desire and ideology as the core tenets of how we understand ourselves and relationships. And so, to give the quote, Matthew Flisfeder writes, Dean, however, proposes that given the demise of symbolic efficiency, since no prohibiting agency exists, desire gives way to drive, which according to her is the form taken by the subject's relation to enjoyment in the information age. In this sense, Dean argues against Zizek's claim that impensatory politics follows an ethics of drive. Dean is an academic scholar that is most likely using Zizek in one of her research studies. But I just found that quote fascinating. Her argument is largely based on the idea that today, everyone knows that the big other does not exist. And therefore, no agency exists that can prevent the subject from realizing her desire. My point, though, is that given these conditions, the subject of late capitalist consumer society, rather than relating to the loss constitutive of subjectivity, that is, the subject of drive, prefers to disavow the fact.
All right, we're pretty close to the Christmas
of the others. The fact of the other's non-existence in order to preserve the pleasure garnered in the pursuit of the lost object of desire. So this is where he loses people, because me reading that I was also like, what the fuck? But the main point really, I think, is right now we are... Oh, the last thing I forgot to point out is symbolicism is another core tenet of Lacan psychology. And how I interpret that is we live in ideologies in this big other concept and agency. You know how like George Orwell writes in 1984, just the big brother? Except the big brother is not just in your head, it is in everyone's head. Well, obviously big brother is like in everybody's head, but it's like kind of like meta. It's both in everybody's head, it's like Foucault's panopticon. It's a type of disciplinary power where people have this feeling that this other is watching them, this big brother is watching them. But at the same time, this big brother is not just like some authoritarian figure that we put in power as the people, but it's kind of this God figure, like this AI figure that people are trying to make. And so people now, when you have a social media, when you start to build a digital identity, you don't just build your own identity off of like personas, off of your branding, whatever. You build an identity off what you think your brands, your friends, or your social circle thinks of you. Now here is where I get a little confused too, because it's so circular. But overall, what I'm trying to understand, and I think is kind of fascinating, is like how I see this is like the wave-particle paradox. So in quantum physics, and why it's so confusing too, there is this phenomenon of the wave-particle duality. Like light, for example, is both a photon, a particle. Photon is light, sorry. Photon is both a particle and a wave. It's kind of saying like one is both 1 and 2, So you're like, how can that be? To me, what this is saying is this big other. Everybody knows that the big other does not exist, and therefore no agency can exist to prevent the subject from realizing her desire. But, the ideology, the ideological function of social media is then one of willing the big other into existence. So this big other, this big, to use Orwellian language, big brother really doesn't big brother is a concept that is just in your head, but social media makes it real. It wills big other into existence, and it is the answer to the question, how will capitalism succeed in reintroducing lack and scarcity into a world of instant access and abundance? Social media has the function of reintroducing a limit into the social field that preserves the subject of desire. There is a limit constitutive of the symbolic order as such. And what I see that is, and how I interpret this is, once, this big other gets introduced, all your desires, both big, good and bad, gets flushed into the world to see. Your privacy is both public, and public is privacy. Fascinating. I had to re-record because I was also getting lost. But simply put, I think what I'm trying to say and how I understand this is big other is this big brother concept distorted. Social media puts big brother into existence, and once you have this big brother person watching you from every angle, you can't have agency, as much as you try to. And hence performative authenticity. And to end it, while we know that the big other does not exist, we act as if this were not the case. Why? The Lacanian joke about the man who thought he was a grain of seed offers a possible explanation. After months of treatment, the man is convinced by his doctor that he is not a grain of seed, but a man. Weeks after he is cured, the man returns in hysterical rage. "What is wrong?" asks his doctor. "I know you are not a grain of seed, but a man." "Yes," replied the man. "I know, but does the chicken know?" This is how the subject reacts to the non-existence of the big other. The problem is not the subject's own belief in the big other. It is rather the ambiguity of the other's belief. Or to take another of Zizek's example, consider the operation of the stock market. When we play the stock market, we are ultimately placing a bet on what the public opinion believes public opinion must be. It is this belief in the other's belief that accounts for our continued relation to the big other, despite our own personal recognition of its non-existence. It is this ambiguity that provides the pretense of our activity. And social media is the platform through which today in popular culture, the big other continues to be operative. Performative authenticity. We post on social media of personas in which we showcase our ideal, our less than ideal selves for this big other, because we're telling this big other, hey, I'm real, I'm this and this. Social media is not real, and I'm gonna say that on social media. We all know it's not real, but so what? It's a platform, just as TV was a platform, just as the radio was a medium. Social media, it's in its name. And we all know the way media works. Advertisements, eyeballs, you capture attention. It's a technology that's not just about, maximizing for attention, eyeballs, doom scrolling. It's a technology of transmitting information about the self. And we have forgotten, I think, maybe not all of us, but we have forgotten the cultural phenomena of what it means to express yourself truly. Not to perform for this big other, to perform for this desire, to perform for an ideology. And to end this, because it's late, and I want to go to sleep, I find that, while this idea, while to end it, because it's late, I find that, Zizek is someone who is, what's the word? I think the modern day Hegel, but if, Hegel, Jung, I know he's, Lacan psychology, but he is an Hegelian scholar, but it's if Hegel, Jung, and Nietzsche had a baby, and then he uses films and media as his examples. I think that's how I see Zizek. Or, I've only read him in, media context, and I read some of his stuff on Substack, which is fascinating. It's very hard to read. That's why I only skim the parts that I try to understand. But I think he is worth just thinking about. And that's the other thing I wanted to bring him up. I feel that modern discourse ought to have more nuance. When we reference scholars or we try to talk about just people, writers, they don't even have to be philosophers, just people who have an opinion. I wish there was more nuance in the way we talked about these stuff, There is a tendency to just, reference someone and then be like, damn, you're an expert, so everything you say must be true. Back to Nietzsche, truth is what you make of it. You can't find truth. Once you find truth, it's no longer truth. The same with beauty, like in art. Truth is something that is constantly being developed as we live our everyday lives. And at the same time, it's like, maybe you'll never find it, maybe you will, and so what? Or it's not even so, it's then what? I'm also seeing all these terms on like fun maxing, blah maxing, blah blah maxing. Like, after we've optimized for everything, then what? Then what? As human beings, then what? We have so much material conveniences. Then what? We've forgotten how to be human. Culture was the social fabric. To quote Byung-Chul Han, we used to have community without communication, and now all we have is communication without community. Everybody talks so much about everything. And now it's come to a point where people don't know how to talk anymore.